Thank you very much, Jo. Our next speaker is Josephine van den Bent, who is working on her PhD, writing up her PhD at the University of Amsterdam on Mamluk representation of Mongols.
Thank you, and thanks to Jo for organizing this panel. Thank you very much. I will today be talking about origin stories about the Mongols as used in Mamluk sources. For one of the questions that historians in Mamluk times were dealing with was the matter of the Mongols. Not only did they concern themselves with the Mongols' activities during their own lifetimes, but they also tried to figure out who it was they were dealing with. Who were the Mongols and where did they come from? Why did they start their extensive conquests? As Ademashki aptly put it, little was known about them because of the vast distances that separated their lands, and they were not mentioned on the tongues of the people, as he literally puts it. In an attempt to place the Mongols within the Arab worldview, many authors mention their descent from Noah's son Japhet, but some include more elaborate origin stories in their works. These origin stories, of course, serve to explain the provenance of these previously unknown people. However, they not only serve as origin stories, but they also involve judgments and explanations and interpretations of contemporary events, as origin stories often do. And a good example is the reported conception of Alan Guo of Chinggis Khan's ancestor from a ray of light, a story that we find in the secret history of the Mongols, the Mongol version of the origin legend. This story reached the Arabic-speaking world through the Persian works, especially those of Juwayni and Rashid ad-Din. And Al-Umari, for instance, and following him, Qalqashandi, they include the story and sharply criticize Alan Guo, and they call her claim, and I'm quoting here, a foul lie and an incorrect rumor. And they suggest that she heard the story of Mary and then used it for her own ends. But the most elaborate story of origin is, however, probably found in Ibn ad-Dawadari's work. And in this paper, I will investigate how this story in his work attempts to explain and interpret the Mongols, the role of the Mongols in the Islamic world in this period. So Abu Bakr ibn Abdullah ibn Aybak ad-Dawadari, we've heard of him, we know him. Two of his works survive. For a quick recap, the Kanz Dur al-Wajami al-Ghurar and Durar al-Tijan wa Ghurar al-Tawarikh al-Azman. He was interested in other peoples and their origin stories. He includes origin stories of the courts, for instance. And similarly, both Kanz Durar and Durar al-Tijan contain a Turkish-Mongol origin legend. The two versions tell the same story, but they are not exact copies of one another. Not only is the phrasing different, the wording's different, but there are some elements of difference between them. They have a somewhat different genealogy, we will see that later, a genealogy for Chinggis Khan. Some of the names are different, some other details are different. Kanz Durar has some parts that Durar al-Tijan lacks. But in this talk, I will present the two versions as one story, which I consider justified given the minimal real difference in content between the two. So Ibn ad-Dawadari introduces the story by stating that in the beginning of the Mongols' exodus and the story of their origin are strange things. Maybe they are strange occurrences and no one has mentioned them in their histories because they do not know about it and because there are things in there that do not agree with the pure Sharia. According to Ibn ad-Dawadari, the story can be found in a book, he says, in their Mongol tongue, is called Ulu Khan Ata Bitikji, which according to him means the book of the great ruling father. He says that he came across the story in a book shown to him by one Amin ad-Din, secretary to the Amir Badr ad-Din al-Baysari, from which Ibn ad-Dawadari then had the chance to copy. Some of you might know this story, others might not. I'm going to give as brief a summary as possible. We are first treated to the origin story of the Turks. As I said, it's a Turkish-Mongol origin story. The version in Durar al-Tijan is a bit short. according to Ibn al-Dawadari, because what the creation story tells us about the creation of the Turks, it's a spontaneous generation in a cave, it conflicts with what Revelation tells us. But apparently in Kanz ad-Durar, he had no such qualms, and he relates the story. He criticizes it, but he relates the story. So, the first Turkish ancestor, Great Father Mun, Ulu Ay Ataji, was originally generated in a cave from clay. Sunlight came in. His line continues on. His line becomes the Atun Khans, the Golden Kings. The cave in which he originated becomes a temple that these people ruled by the Atun Kings pray to. The Atun Khan rules over people in two great cities, Asharmak or Kasharmak in the Durar al-Tijan and Aydarmak. And they are magnificent cities whose people live in joy, in wealth, they have great health. They also do not have enemies that frighten them. And that little detail might already suggest to you that this utopia was not to last. Because it wasn't. For as Ibn al-Dawadari says, fate made them servants after ruling, humiliating them after glory. And this is where the story of the origin of the Turks is connected to the story of the origin of the Mongols. For the story relates, the ancestor of Chinggis Khan was born to a Tibetan woman. She walked off to get some grass to wrap him in, and at that moment an eagle flew in, snatched him up, and carried him off. He dropped him at the foot of the Karatagh mountain. That is the mountain also where the Turkish ancestor originated, in a cave on the Karatagh mountain. So that's already a connection between the Turks and the Mongols. I'll come back to that later. So the eagle drops him, and he lands in the thicket. And he is found by a lioness who has just given birth herself, and she thinks he is one of her cubs. So she feeds him, and she raises him, and he grows up. He subjugates the lions, he eats their meat for food, and one day a group of people wanders into the area, and they are threatened by the lions. He sees them, and he recognizes himself in them, or as Ibn al-Dawadari puts it, he felt jinsiyah with them. So he rescues them, and once they realize that he will not harm them, they teach him their language. So far he'd only been roaring like a lion. They introduce him to cooked meat, rather than the raw meat he was used to eating, and these people were called the Tatars. There is a girl among them, and he has a child with her, who they call Tatar Khan, and this boy raised by lions himself is called Alp Arkara Aslan Biljikshi, meaning son of the black lion. So he has a son, and we have a story in which we find this genealogy. And according to the story, the current Tatars all descend from the first Chinggis Khan, Oghuz Khan, and Altun Khan. As I mentioned before, there are some differences between the genealogies. I've given an overview on the slide, as you see. The one in Kanz ad-Durar, that's the right one, is probably the correct one, because otherwise the timeline is off for when these Tatars become the vassals of the Turkish Altun Khan. Because that's what happens, according to the story. These Tatars are all very savage, very barbarian, and they become the vassals of the Turkish Altun Khan, who rules over these two cities. At one point, Chinggis Khan, the blacksmith, is born. So Chinggis Khan, the blacksmith, on the left, and Chinggis Khan Timurji on the right. And the story tells us that he frequently visited the two cities. He says he would go to a blacksmith in the city called Asharmak. From him he learned how to make arrowheads, and from him he would take iron and return to his land and make these arrowheads year after year, and then return with them and sell them. All seemed well, but problems arose when the eldest of Chinggis Khan's sons, Tatar Khan in the one and Bishkan in Kanz ad-Durar, he went on a hunt with the son of the Altun Khan, who was called Kumush Khan. And their hunting both attacked the same swan. But rather than granting the animal to his superior, Chinggis Khan's son snatched Kumush Khan's bird off the swan and gave the swan to his own bird of prey. Kumush Khan goes into a fit of rage, rides off home, and Bishkan tells the story to his father, to Chinggis Khan, and Chinggis Khan correctly foresees that this will cause trouble. However, Chinggis Khan says, I have seen in a dream that I will be victorious over them. He rouses the other Tatars. They gather to elect a leader, and after a ritual in which a stew offering is placed for a felt idol, Chinggis Khan is elected leader after a supernatural decision in his favor. They have, however, few weapons, little gear, few horses, and when Atun Khan sends a messenger with 700 troops to summon Chinggis Khan and his sons to the palace, the Tatars wait until nightfall and kill all the men. They take the gear and horses, adding to their meager supplies. And the Atun Khan then sends 50,000 troops, far outnumbering the Tatars. Chinggis Khan decides to trick them by fleeing at the first attack and to wait for them to settle down for the night, to get incredibly drunk, and then he returns and kills them. Again, they take their gear and their horses, and after that, the Atun Khan sends another, even bigger army. And this time, they have enough gear for all of them, and they dress up sticks with the leftover gear so that the Atun Khan's army will think they're with more. They attack the army from 4 sides, they win, and finally they enter the Turkish cities wearing the gear of the Turkish army, tricking everyone into thinking that they are the returning victors. And he goes into the palace, Chinggis Khan that is, he kills the Atun Khan and takes the throne. He sends out the Turkish subjects of the cities to work for him and to pay him taxes, and he divides the lands among his sons. And here it is Ibn al-Dawadari says that the story ends, and he turns to Ibn Wasil and Ibn al-Athir to discuss the Mongols' appearance in the Islamic world. So Uri Harman has written several articles about the role of Turkish historiography in Egypt and Sultanate in general. He's also discussed his origin story in particular. And this story is, apart from being very enthralling and riveting by itself, it's also very interesting for a number of other reasons. And among them are an echo of the themes and motives from the Mongols' own origin story, the secret history. Another element is the representation of the Tatars of the Mongols in this story, which is very briefly put, we find them as extraordinarily strong and courageous, but very savage. Today, however, I wish to discuss the way in which this origin legend aims to offer an explanation for later developments. This is, of course, the primary goal of many, if not all, origin myths, whether told by the people it concerns or whether told by people from other groups. Origin myths tend to explain contemporary or near-contemporary circumstances and events, and this purpose is explicitly mentioned in this story. In Dur al-Tijan, one of the headings is the beginning of the Tatar people and the first cause of their exodus, أول سبب خروجهم. The story just seeks to explain the cause for the Mongols' exodus from their homeland and their incursion into and conquest of other lands. However, the story offers explanations for other historical developments, facts, and circumstances as well. I cannot be exhaustive here, but I will name a few of the most important elements. So one of the things that stands out most in this respect is the connection made between the Turks and the Mongols. And this is, of course, something that we know from very many Mamluk-era sources. Many authors connected the two peoples. Abu Shama famously wrote that the Mongols were defeated by men of their own ethnicity, أبناء جنسهم من الترك. And 2 years ago at this conference in Liège, I spoke about Ibn al-Nafis's treatise Al-Risala al-Kamiliyya. And in this text he argues that the only one who can defeat the Mongols is a sultan who is ethnically very close to him, i.e. the Turkish Baybars. Uri Hamann has already pointed this out very briefly in his work, but this connection between the Turks and the Mongols is also present here. We see a great many details that show that. We see a constant confusion between whether the Mongols speak a Mongol or a Turkish language, both are mentioned on the same page. He says that the book in which these stories are found are greatly revered by both the Kipchak Turks and by the Mongols. One of Chinggis Khan's forebears, one of the Tatar Khans, He was the first, he says, to make the Turkish flute, which is called sibusru. So you see all these little details. But far more important than these are the way that the two origin stories have been woven together. They're inextricably connected. And as such, the stories aim not to explain only their shared heritage, which Hermann mentioned, but it also very much shows their relations in the time of the Mongol conquest. We first find the story of the Turks, the spontaneous generation of their ancestor who then rise to great glory and prosperity before the Mongols even appear on the scene. The male ancestor is quite literally imported from Tibet. The wandering Tatars, they also move in from elsewhere. So they're actually, whereas the Turkish are born literally from the clay of the land, the Mongols come in from outside. The Turks come in first and then come the Mongols. So it reflects the historical reality on the one hand, that Central Asia, that the Turks rose to power there far before the Mongols ever did. But it also reflects a Damascus problem that no one had really heard of the Mongols before. They just appeared to sort of show up, which they also do in this story. It might even reflect an ideology that the Mongols had no real right to this area, that it rightfully belonged to the Turks. And this interpretation can be supported by the story of the cause for the conflict, that the son of Chinggis Khan takes the swan that is by right Kumash Khan's the son of the Turkish Khaan. And this story also explains the continued enmity between the two peoples. The Mongols, by the actions of the son who snatches away the bird, rightfully the Turks, led to a war between the two, which ended in the Mongol takeover of the Turkish throne in the story, which reflects the events in Central Asia in the 13th century. It allows the reader of this story, or the person listening to it being recounted, to see an explanation for the continued enmity between the Turkish Mamluks and the ethnically closely related Mongols. The typical elements of Mongol warfare are also explained in this story. The Mongols were of course known primarily for their use of mounted archers, as well as for their sometimes deceptive battle tactics, for instance feigning retreat and then rounding back and attacking their by then disorganized pursuers. And according to this story, Chinggis Khan was taught by a Turkish blacksmith how to make arrowheads, and he would sell those. This firstly conveniently explains his birth name, which is Temujin, but is frequently incorrectly rendered Temurjin, in which Temur is then interpreted as iron, hence blacksmith. So this false etymology on the one hand explains the name, but it also links the Mongols to their weapon of choice, the bow and arrow. Similarly, after the episode of Chinggis Khan's election to leadership, in Kanzadurar, a brief excursion is included into a separate tale involving one of Chinggis Khan's forebears, who captured and tamed a primeval horse that struck fire with its hooves, hence its name At-Atan, or fire horse. It was supposedly faster than the wind and could overtake any animal it wanted. And part of the horses that the Mongols rode into the battle against the Altan Khan were descendants of this primeval horse, according to this story. So this story connects the Mongols to their use of excellent horses, for which they were also famous. Third, the description of Chinggis Khan's battles in this story, and more particularly the battle tricks we see, reflect the later Mongol battle tactics. In this story, they are presented as being the result from the Mongols' dire lack of resources and of men, forcing them to be creative and cunning in order to defeat the Turks. So in the historical reality of the 13th century, the Mongols were known for these strategies, for which this story thus offers an origin. Another element, this is also something that Hermann has mentioned, is that various signs within the story is that the Mongols will not be able to conquer the West. So when Chinggis Khan relates the dream he had, he describes how he saw himself standing on this Karatak mountain. Sorry, I forgot this one. Saying, "It was as if I was on top of the Karatak and I grabbed the sun by its horns from east to west and I gave it to you, but the western side slipped away from my hand." A similar statement is found during Chinggis Khan's election as leader of the Mongols, when the three candidates all leave out sacrificial bowls of stew. The one whose portion gets eaten was to be their leader, and Chinggis Khan's bowl gets emptied almost. The story says, his bowl came out eaten, apart from a little bit, which was on the western side of the bowl. Both these statements are a clear reference to the fact that the Mongols did not manage to conquer the west of the Islamic world. The Mamluk armies defeated them at Ain Jalut in 1260, and they never managed to rule the area past the Euphrates. So, we have the relations between the Turks and the Mongols. We have the Mongol style of warfare, and we have the Mongols' failure to conquer the west and the Islamic world. All these elements, and a few more, are explained in this origin myth. Some are subtle and others are less so. Especially the prediction that they will never be able to hold the West is rather obvious. But this story is thus a great example of a historian using an origin myth, a literary text, to explain circumstances and events of his day and age. Thank you.